The court upheld all statements made in response to interrogation by a defendant in police custody would be admissible at trial only if the prosecution can show that the defendant was informed of the right to consult with an attorney before and during questioning, and of the right against self-incrimination before police questioning. The court ruled that a right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment extended to a woman's decision to have an abortion, but that this right must be balanced against the state's two legitimate interests in regulating abortions, protecting prenatal life and protecting the woman's health. In Texas v. Johnson, the decision by the Supreme Court invalidated prohibitions that desecrated the American flag enforced in 48 states. In Atkins v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled that executing intellectually disabled individuals violates the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishments, but states can define who is intellectually disabled. In Roper v. Simmons, the Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to impose the death penalty for a crime committed by a child under the age of 18. In Duncan v. Louisiana, a majority vote by the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Duncan, arguing that the right to a jury trial in criminal cases was fundamental and central to the American concept of justice. As such, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment requires states to honor requests for jury trials. In Lee v. Weissman, the U.S. Supreme Court decision regarding school prayers, ruling that schools may not sponsor clerics to conduct even non-denominational prayer, the court followed a broad interpretation of the Establishment Clause that had been standard for decades at the nation's highest court. In U.S. v. Miller, the Supreme Court stated that the National Firearms Act, as applied to one indicted for transporting in interstate commerce a 12-gauge shotgun with a barrel less than 18 inches long, without having registered it and without having in his possession a stamp affixed written order for it, as required for the act, held that it is not constitutional as an invasion of the reserved powers of the states, and it does not violate the Second Amendment of the Constitution. In a 6-3 decision balancing between the individual's, even a child's, legitimate expectation of privacy and the school's interest in maintaining order and discipline, they decided to hold for the state. According to school officials, they do require a reasonable suspicion to perform a search. In D.C. v. Heller, the court decided that the Second Amendment protects an individual's rights to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia and to use that firearm for traditionally lawful purposes such as self-defense within the home. The Board of Education v. Earls was a case in which the court upheld the constitutionality of mandatory drug testing by public schools of students participating in extracurricular activities. In Brandsburg v. Hayes, the Supreme Court decision invalidated the use of the First Amendment as a defense for reporters summoned to testify before a grand jury. In this case, the reporter lost by a vote of 5-4, but nonetheless, this case is cited for the rule that in federal courts, a reporter may not avoid testifying in a criminal grand jury. In Gideon v. Wainwright, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that states are required under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution to provide counsel in criminal cases to represent defendants who are unable to afford to pay for their own attorneys. The case extended the identical requirement that has been imposed on the federal government under the 5th and 6th Amendments. In Ingram v. Wright, the U.S. Supreme Court case upheld the disciplinary corporal punishment policy of Florida's public schools by a 5-4 vote. In Engel v. Vitale, the Supreme Court case ruled that it is unconstitutional for state officials to compose an official school prayer and encourage its recitation in public schools. The Supreme Court defined the constitutional rights of students in the public school system, and the Tinker test is still used by courts to determine whether a school's disciplinary actions violate students' First Amendment rights. In the Rotary International versus Rotary Club of Duarte, the court found that the relationship among the club's members was not of the intimate or private variety which warrants the First Amendment protection. Writing for the unanimous court, Justice Powell argued that because many of the Rotary's activities, including their meetings, are conducted in the presence of strangers and because women members would not prevent the club from carrying out its purposes, there was no violation of associational rights. In Mapp v. Ohio, the Supreme Court decided that evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, may not be used in state law criminal prosecutions in state courts, as well as had previously been the law as in federal criminal law prosecutions in federal courts. In Bush v. Gore, the United States Supreme Court decision resolved the dispute surrounding the 2000 presidential election. 3 days earlier, the court had preliminarily halted the Florida recount that was occurring. The court, by a 5-4 vote, ruled that no alternative method could be established within the time limit set by Title III of the U.S. Code. By 7-2 vote of the court, they had ruled that there was an Equal Protection Clause violation in using different standards accounting in different counties. In California v. Greenwood, the Supreme Court held that the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit the warrantless search and seizure of garbage left for collection outside the curtilage of a home. In Escobedo v. Illinois, the Supreme Court held that criminal suspects have a right to counsel during police interrogations under the Sixth Amendment. The case was decided a year after the court held in Gideon v. Wainwright that indigent criminal defendants had a right to be provided counsel at trial. In Vernonia v. Acton, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of random drug testing regimen implemented by the local public schools in Vernonia, Oregon. Under that regimen, student athletes were required to submit to random drug testing before being allowed to participate in sports. The Supreme Court held that although the tests were searches under the Fourth Amendment, they were reasonable in light of the school's interest in preventing teenage drug use. In the New York Times v. Sullivan, the Supreme Court case established that the actual malice standard, which has to be met before press reports about public officials can be considered to be defamation and libel, and hence allowed free reporting of the civil rights campaign in the southern United States. It is one of the key decisions supporting the freedom of the press. The actual malice standard requires that the plaintiff in a defamation or libel case prove that the publisher of the statement in question knew that the statement was false or acted in reckless disregard of its truth or falsity. Because of the extremely high burden of proof on the plaintiff and the difficulty of proving the defendant's knowledge and intentions, such cases, when they involve public figures, rarely prevail. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. In Coker v. Georgia, the Supreme Court held that the Eighth Amendment forbids the death penalty for the crime of rape. The Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by a non-profit corporation. The principles articulated by the Supreme Court in the case have also been extended to for-profit corporations, labor unions, and other associations. In Loving v. Virginia, the decision of the United States Supreme Court invalidated laws prohibiting interracial marriage. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision held this prohibition was unconstitutional, reversing Pace v. Alabama and ending all race-based legal restrictions on marriage in the United States. In Schenck v. U.S., the Supreme Court unanimously concluded that defendants who distributed leaflets to draft-age men urging resistance to induction could be convicted of an attempt to obstruct the draft, which is a criminal offense. The First Amendment did not alter the well-established law in cases where the attempt was made through expressions that would be protected in other circumstances. In Apodaca v. Oregon, the court held that state juries may convict a defendant even if it is not unanimous, even though federal law requires that federal juries must reach criminal verdicts unanimously. The four-justice plurality opinion of the court affirmed that judgment of the Oregon Court of Appeals and held that there was no constitutional right to a unanimous verdict. Thus, Oregon's law did not violate due process. In the U.S. v. Lopez, there was a 5-4 decision stating that the Supreme Court affirmed the decision of the Court of Appeals. It held that while Congress had broad lawmaking authority under the Commerce Clause, the power was limited and did not extend so far from commerce as to authorize the regulation of the carrying of handguns, especially when there was no evidence that carrying them affected the economy on a massive scale.